One of the things that makes the Egyptian gods wonderful to me is that you always are conscious that they could squish you flat, but they don't. They choose not to. So there's sort of a lovely thing there where you're always conscious of the power and the majesty that resides within them. But towards mortals, they are very, very gentle and very kindly.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. And today, we are discussing ancient Egypt, Kemetic Orthodox religion, and more with Dr. Tamara Siuda. Dr. Siuda is the perfect expert to speak with about this fascinating universe of ancient Egyptian history, spiritual practices, and the living presence of these deities, and how one can actually not only learn about and approach, but worship these beings with ancient ceremonial rites. Dr. Siuda is a professional Egyptologist and the founder and spiritual leader of the Kemetic Orthodox religion, and she's also an initiated mamba, or a priestess, of Haitian Vodou, and she's written numerous books and academic papers about both Egypt and Haiti, and Dr. Siuda is involved in various charitable and other efforts to benefit both countries' peoples and her own Native American ancestors. Dr. Siuda's books include the Ancient Egyptian Prayer Book and the Ancient Egyptian Day Book, and you can also support Dr. Siuda on Patreon as well. I'm also incredibly thankful for previous podcast guest Lori Romano to first introduce me to Dr. Siuda's work. Also, listeners, just a quick note, if it sounds like I'm jumping into Dr. Siuda's answers in the first few questions of the podcast, that's only because the audio wasn't recording quite right on my end in the beginning, and so I rephrased a few of the points that Dr. Siuda makes. Also, yes, you get to absolutely enjoy my horrible pronunciation of Egyptian words, and thankfully, Dr. Siuda showing me mercy and helping me out there. So, for many listeners of the podcast who practice the quote-unquote Solomonic tradition or grimoire traditionalism, we might be familiar with the migration of the grimoires from the time period of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri and the techniques there, and then the migration of the techniques into the Byzantine Empire and then into Europe and beyond. But what about the ancient Egyptian practices? What about ancient Egyptian rites and ceremonies that came well before the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri? What was practiced, and how and why is it so important throughout the generations? And also, what are the similarities between so-called grimoiric magic and these ancient rites? And as the world deals with the COVID-19, the novel coronavirus pandemic, how did the Egyptians approach sickness, protection, and healing? Well, Dr. Siuda discusses all of these topics. She answers your Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Tamara Siuda. Dr. Tamara Siuda, thank you so much for lending us the gift of your time and your wisdom and stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So I definitely, Dr. Siuda, want to ask you about your early childhood experiences and your interest in ancient Egypt, but I was on your website earlier, and I think you actually introduced this way better than I ever could with a post on your website where you say, quote, "I was born at 13 minutes to midnight on a particularly busy July 19th, the 200th day of 1969. My parents passed time in the delivery room watching television, alternating between live news coverage of Apollo 11 having entered lunar orbit and a biopic on Harry Houdini. My childhood dreams were fueled by an eagle landing and a daring escape artist. I wanted to be an explorer, and I wanted to be a magician, and somehow I've managed to do a little bit of both along the way." So, Dr. Siuda, that is so awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first began walking down your path of being an explorer and a magician?
I think I was born. I think that was the start. I grew up, you noted earlier, that I am indigenous, that I am a Native American. I was raised in that culture. For us, the spiritual and the unseen and the magical are never far away. My family never lived in a space where those things were separate from everyday life. There was always something spiritual. There was always something magical. There was always an opportunity to explore the world that we lived in, and we were encouraged to do that. So I can't really pin a single event. I can't say this is the day that I began to be a magician, or this is the day that I got interested in ancient Egypt. It all just kind of happened, and it happened over time. And some of it happened very early. I have very early memories of being interested in Egyptian things and reading about them. And very early, before I went to school, I started to dream about a woman who had wings. And I explained her to my mother, and I said, well, yeah, she looks... My mother said, oh, she sounds like an angel. And I said, well, her wings are black. And she said, oh, well, that's a very interesting angel. It never discounted me. My mother never, my little sister talked to dead people, and oh, well, what did they say to you? My mother was never disparaging of any experiences that any of us had. And so she said, well, this person must be important. You should talk to her and find out what she wants. And mostly she just wanted to talk. And so we talked. And I remember talking to her before I went to sleep for lots of years. And it was first grade when we went on a museum visit to the Field Museum in Chicago, which was a couple of hours from where I'd grown up in Michigan. And we went into the Egyptian exhibit, and I came face to face with the statue of the goddess Nephthys, who's called Neptet in ancient Egyptian. And I said, oh, look, there's this woman, and she's wearing the same color as the woman that I talk to every day, and she has black wings, and this is very interesting. And so then I went home and looked into that. But the museum experience was also interesting because I was so fascinated by the Egyptian material that when the teacher said that we should get in line and get ready to go upstairs to look at dinosaurs, I snuck away from the group and I crawled into a sarcophagus, a stone sarcophagus, which at the time was not covered. It's funny, now it's covered. When I used to give tours, when I became a grown-up, 20-some years later, and I was actually working at the museum and giving tours to people, I noticed that there was glass on top of this sarcophagus now, and sometimes I wonder if it was my fault. But yeah, so I crawled inside the stone sarcophagus and waited for the class to leave, and then I jumped back out, and I spent the rest of the afternoon in the Egyptian exhibit, and then snuck back onto the bus, and nobody noticed. So it worked out.
So that's why when I go to museums, all the sarcophagi are just covered now.
Yeah, well, in the Field Museum, this particular one has a huge glass sheet molded to the top of it now, and a big sign that says try not to climb into it. So.
It is so fascinating, Dr. Siuda, because I think for so many people who are kind of growing up ancient Egypt, always, whether it's through movies or media or books, like it always has this kind of romantic, kind of fantasy-esque topography to it. But it sounds like for you, it was incredibly, for lack of a better word, tangible. Like most people who are growing up probably don't have that vision of a direct face-to-face encounter with as you mentioned, quote unquote, when you were talking with your mother, angel with black wings. So can you talk about that kind of tangibility? Like, was it something where you said, oh my gosh, you're face-to-face in the museum and you're like, this is not only very real, but it's something that's been with me for as long as I can remember?
I was definitely surprised by it. For a long time, I didn't. She never said what her name was. We never. I mean, obviously, it's been a very long time now. I'm 50. I don't know that I remember the exact conversations that we had, but I don't recall her ever being, imperious and saying, I am the goddess such and such. I want you to do this. It was just general conversations. It was the way that you talk to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. But in first grade, so then I'm 6. I remember seeing this image and being cognizant that it looked very much like this being that I already had a relationship with. And then I read the card, and the card said that she was a goddess and that she had certain associations with certain things. And so then I was wandering all over the exhibit looking for other images of her, and they all looked the same, and it was very interesting. So that, for me, that started a research that has been with me through my whole experience with the Nacheru, or the ancient Egyptian gods, where I will have an experience or I will have an understanding or an epiphany or something like that. And then almost immediately it will be followed up by finding some data, some sort of research point that helps me understand this experience that I've had. And so the two things have gone together. For me, it's two things. It's confirmation, but then it's also the hint that, okay, your own experience is probably not all there is to this. So find out more about it. See if you can explain what it has to do. And that's the explorer part. of the magician, I guess. Like, all right, we've had this experience. Now let's find out what it means. Let's test it. Let's see if it's real. Let's see how much of it's made up.
For you, it was these kind of very, very tangible experiences that then were confirmed later by, oh my gosh, here's a piece of data, here's a piece of history. And then slowly, did it feel like you were kind of putting together some kind of esoteric puzzle in a way? Or did it feel like just a more gradual revelatory process?
It's kind of felt like both things. And over time, I've also added that additional level where, you research something first and then you experience it. It wasn't always experiences all the time, but it did start that way.
To that point, Dr. Siuda, given these experiences, can you share about your interest in exploring the esoteric, whether that was organizations that you explored or kind of applying a formal esoteric investigatory process to these experiences you were having? Was that something that occurred gradually, or how did that come about?
I think that was gradually over time, partially my own interests and partially familial interests. My mother and my grandmother both are mediums. My grandmother was a spiritualist, my maternal grandmother. My father's parents were Jews. They were actually not Jewish, but their parents were, and when they had left Europe during all of the problems there, they remade themselves and told everybody that they were Polish. And so they became really Catholic. And so I remember that their household was full of icons and was very, very austere, even though they didn't seem to be particularly religious. They wanted everybody to see that they were religious, which it wasn't until I was an adult that I found out why all of that was. I grew up in households that were particularly religiously oriented in different ways. My mother's older sister joined a televangelist church, so we had that kind of religion in the house too. My mother's father kept with his indigenous beliefs and was, I wouldn't say that he wasn't church going because he would have gone had he not been ill. He had emphysema and he spent a lot of time at home, but he was very nature oriented. For him, church was to go put a chair outside and sit by the trees and talk to them and do things like that. Spiritual things and esoteric things existed all the time. There was nothing separate, I guess. I can't distinguish things that were only esoteric, I suppose. When I go back and I look at the way that I was brought up and the things that we believed in and the things that we did. After my grandfather died, I had a very hard time with Christianity in particular. I was uncomfortable with some of the things that had been said at his funeral, and I took a step back and I stopped going to church. I had only been going to church for like a year and a half at that point, and so I stopped. That was a Methodist church, incidentally. There's more than one kind of church. I don't mean to assume that Christianity is the default.
And Dr. Siuda, can you share about how you also explored Buddhism?
I had a falling out of Buddhism because I realized that inherently I did not believe in the first noble truth. I didn't believe that life had to be suffering. I believe that life is often suffering for a lot of people, and I agreed that that comes out of desire, but I didn't think it had to be. I was really hung up on this idea that everything was doomed to be suffering and nothing could be perfect. And, that was my indigenous upbringing speaking and saying, no, the world's not so terrible. But my teacher at the time said, well, if you can't even handle the first noble truth, then maybe Buddhism isn't for you. So I kept searching and I did look into worshiping the ancient Egyptian gods, but at the time I couldn't find anybody who did it, and it didn't seem like it was a thing that was done. So I politely left it to the side. I grew up in the 1980s, so that was the time when everybody was reading Rolling Stone, and in the back of Rolling Stone I found an advertisement for a group called the Fellowship of Isis that was in Ireland. And I thought, oh, well, hey, this is Egyptian. Let's check this out. So I sent off a letter and got a letter back from the Lady Olivia Robertson from some castle in Ireland. And I was very impressed because I was 14. And she said, why, yes, there are thousands and thousands of people who worship ancient Egyptian gods, and you can join us. And so I did. So I studied with the FOI a little bit. Well, at that time, I was not able to connect with anybody in the FOI who was strictly worshiping Egyptian gods. The FOI itself, if you're familiar, bills itself as a goddess worship organization, and most of the people who are there worship lots of different goddesses from lots of different cultures. And that was fine, and it worked out fine. And a couple of years later, I went to college, I moved to Chicago, I hooked up with a group of Wiccans who were worshiping mostly Welsh deities, and that was also fine. My Egyptian gods were kind of there in the background, but they weren't my primary set of devotions at the time.
And Dr. Siuda, can you share about the Wiccan initiatory experience that you had and the expectation that you had for that going into it?
I had the expectation. I had been trained to assume that a particular Welsh goddess would show up, and she didn't. And in fact, a number of ancient Egyptian gods showed up. And over the course of however long that experience was, they proceeded to encourage me to walk away from the Welsh practice that I was doing and to worship them as my primary deities. Basically, to give my devotions to them and to be prepared because they expected that there would be more people who would have interest and that they wanted to connect. It wasn't a sort of, we're not in the world and we need you to bring us back. It was we want to be in the world more and we anticipate that you'll have an opportunity to be part of that. So we're making you an offer to help us out. So when I left the room where the ritual had occurred and reported to my superior about what I had seen, she said, "So what happened?" And I said, "Well, I have to quit." She said, "What do you mean you have to quit?" And so I told her everything that I had seen, and I fully expected that I was going to get castigated, that there would be some complaints because clearly that was not what I was supposed to be doing in that room. But her reaction was very positive. And she said, "Oh, well, if this is something that they want from you and that's something that you want to do, then so you should do it. And you have my blessing." And she encouraged me very much.
Dr. Siuda, and then following that, after you received your blessing following the Wiccan initiatory experience to explore these Egyptian deities, you then went back to the leader of the FOI, of the Fellowship of Isis, and what did you tell her?
I told her what had happened, and I said, I need to find the right people to train me to do the right things, because clearly there's something I need to do here. I don't know what it is, but there's something I need to do. And by that time, there were people in Boston who were arranging a temple that was strictly for Egyptian gods, and she introduced me to them. And I studied with them for several years. And then I was initiated as a priestess during the 1993 Parliament of World Religions, when we all got together. And a couple of years after that, the local people that were getting together once a week at my house for ritual and for teaching, we decided not to be part of the FOI any longer.
Dr. Siuda, that's so fascinating because it is here around 1994 that is the beginning of Kemetic Orthodoxy and the House of Necher Temple. And as you've said elsewhere, there was an exponential surge in membership, and currently there's about 600 people who are involved in the temple. Can you talk about what is Kemetic Orthodoxy, and how does that differ, especially with so many other terms thrown around like Egyptian dynastic ceremonial rites and Egyptian magic? Can you give us some of the details?
Kemetic Orthodoxy is my invention. It is an attempt to sit with ancient data. So I went and I got a degree in Egyptology and I learned how to read hieroglyphs. And so I went and I actually started to read ancient religious texts and translate them and make sense of them, try to understand what they were doing. So then we wanted to take it a step further. It wasn't so much, let's translate these ancient texts and then let's perform them. It wasn't an act of performance. It wasn't an attempt to pretend to be ancient Egyptians it wasn't like the Society for Creative Anachronism where we were going to dress up in a bunch of clothes and we'd say a bunch of spooky words and generally, try to be Egyptians. That was never the intention. The intention was to find out what it was that the ancient culture was doing in terms of this devotional practice with their deities and why, and what were the meanings behind it and what would be the reasons to continue to do it. What we wanted to understand, myself and the handful of people that were coming together to do this thing, we wanted to understand why. We wanted to understand what the ancient Egyptians were interested in and what they were after. And there's a Japanese proverb from the poet Basho that says, "Seek not to do as the men of old, but seek what they sought." That was our foundational question when we decided we wanted to try to do this thing. It wasn't an attempt to just resurrect the ideas of the ancient Egyptian culture or to, assimilate them or to do anything like that. It was to say to ourselves, these are real people, these are real deities. What were they doing? Why did it stop? Would there be any value to picking it up where it left off, continuing it? Was there any reason to continue this? And so one of the things that we came across was the idea that I had mentioned earlier, that there's more than one ancient Egyptian religion. There are, in fact, lots of them, regional ones for different places and different times and different deities. There were a number of different and related practices. We discovered that. We discovered also that while the ancient Egyptian religion did stop, it wasn't necessarily voluntary. There were places throughout, and so this falls into the practices and the areas that a lot of your listeners are probably in, where they're looking at classical period material or Greco-Roman material. So early on in the Roman Empire, under Septimius Severus, pharaonic religion was actually made illegal. And so people who tell you that it's the Christians who stopped pharaonic religion, that's actually not true. It was a Roman pagan who stopped it. And he stopped it for political reasons. He was very uncomfortable about what he considered to be foreign cults in the empire. And, the Egyptian religions were not the only religions that were prescribed. He also went after Zoroastrianism. He went after Manichaeanism. He went after a number of the cults of Gaul and other areas. So it was not explicitly directed at Egyptian religion, but it had an effect. The temples were closed. The priests were denied their state income. And so the cults became private and became much quieter. And over time, some of those things were lost or they were assimilated into other practices. Now, there were definitely Christian emperors who made things more difficult for people who continued to worship ancient Egyptian deities. And eventually, most of them had lots of success. And then by the 6th century, you have the Arab invasion, and they cracked down on everything. Everything that is not official to the state, depending on who is in charge of the caliphate. Some of the caliphates were more, I guess, cosmopolitan than others, and some of them were okay with people who were not Muslims, and some of them were not. But your end result, by the 9th century in Egypt, the 9th century after Christ, you've lost a lot of the indigenous culture. Everybody is being required to speak Arabic by law and to write in Arabic and to do all their business in Arabic. Anything that is not Islamic practice in religion is not allowed in public in any way. And so that has a huge silencing and erasing effect on culture. That being said, pharaonic culture existed for millennia. Pharaonic people existed for millennia and continue to exist. And both Egyptian Christianity and Egyptian Islam contain lots and lots and lots of pharaonic cultural and even religious practices. My doctoral dissertation, is about Coptic martyrology, but it is explicitly about the reason that martyrology is different from all the rest of the Christian martyrologies. And the answer is that Egyptians culturally, way back to their pharaonic roots, already believed in helpful dead people. And so the cult of the saints in Egypt owes just as much to Christianity as it does to indigenous Egyptian pharaonic ideas of the ancestors who come back to help and who are given devotion. So for us, fast forward to us in Kemetic Orthodoxy, we're trying to put something together that's respectful. We don't want to steal anything. We don't want to be saying that, we know better than the Egyptian culture. But so the first question that we answered for ourselves was, why did this religious practice quit? Why did these deities who received all of this attention for thousands of years suddenly not get any? Was that because those deities are dead? Was it because they're not interested in people anymore? And the answer was, it was mostly politics that stopped this practice, and that the practice did continue quietly, privately, here and there, and not in any kind of state-directed way, not in any kind of unbroken way. It goes back to this multiple practice going way back. It goes underground. Eventually it becomes subsumed into other culture. So it continues to exist, but not in the same form. And then the next question that we had for ourselves was, is there any reason to assume that these deities would be interested in receiving the kinds of devotional practices that they used to get in ancient times? Would they want them again? Given that these things have stopped, would they be interested in that? And would that be welcome? And would that be appropriate? And over time, through our own research, through our own experiences, through what we believe to be the direction of those deities, the answer to that was yes, they were interested in receiving devotion again. They were still very interested in not only in their own people, but in anybody who was interested in them. That also happened in antiquity. One of the biggest devotional cults for the goddess Isis was actually not in Egypt. It was in Rome. And Romans took that all the way to the British Isles, and they took it east into parts of India. Alexander the Great took pharaonic deities with him to the east. There were pharaonic devotions happening in many different places over lots of time. So it wasn't necessarily, while it obviously starts in Egypt and it cannot be erased from Egypt, and it shouldn't be erased from Egypt, The Egyptian deities are super friendly. It's also one of the reasons that I kind of like being a devotee of theirs. They're not mean, they're not fickle, they're not hard to worship. They are, in fact, pretty friendly and seem to like people's attentions. What we have tried to do with Kemetic Orthodoxy is to have a practice that is founded and grounded in these ancient practices, using ancient texts that have been translated, that we understand what's going on with them, trying to put them together as authentically as we can, and then also acknowledging the fact that we are not ancient Egyptians and we're never going to be back in the Stone Age or the Iron Age, nor do we really need to be, and to sit with these deities in a modern space. Some people refer to doing a polytheism that's based on ancient Egyptian gods as a reconstruction. I understand that term and I appreciate that term, but I don't use it personally. For me, reconstruction is taking something that's broken and putting it back together. I don't think we can, and I don't think we should. We are not ancient Egyptians. We never will be. To me, there's only so much value in fixing what's broken. What was broken of pharaonic religion happened for lots of reasons, and we are not the same people, and we will not be the same people. So trying to reconstruct doesn't necessarily make all the sense. The term that we like to use is revival, to take something that has stopped and to put life back into it. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring back the worship of the ancient deities while fully acknowledging that we are not ancient people.
Can you talk about, Dr. Siuda, to that point, when you were going through this Wiccan kind of rite of passage and you were just all of a sudden coming face to face with this Egyptian deity, you mentioned that the deities are not kind of overtly, incredibly powerful, but not overtly frightening and, oh my gosh, we never want to be worshipped, etc. Can you talk about that in term, because I think for a lot of people coming from the monotheistic tradition, especially people who practice grimoires, there might be a kind of tendency of this perception of like the always terrible deity kind of staring over you and dangling you over an eternal fire. Can you kind of talk about how what you experienced is very different from that?
Well, I don't know that it was very different. I was terrified. First, it was unexpected. Second, it was not the experience that I had had as a small child where, I had had this experience of a deity. It was so gentle and it was so straightforward that it took me many years to understand that it even was a deity. Now, this was very different. These are also very hard things to talk about, to put spiritual things into terms. I was meditating and I was doing trance work, and then I was thinking about standing on the beach of Lake Michigan, which was behind the place where I lived at the time was actually right on the beach. So I did a lot of praying at the beach. And so I'm sitting in this room and I'm doing my trance work and I'm mentally building the beach in my head. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm standing on the beach and I'm going to pray to the moon and I'm going to do these things. And then things start happening in the vision that are not the things that I'm creating. Pretty soon, suddenly this is not at all what I had sat down and intended to do. And not only was it not what I had intended to do, it wasn't anything that I would have thought of. It's kind of that equivalent of when you have a dream and it's a lucid dream and you know what's happening and then suddenly something happens that, wait a minute, where's this coming from? And then you're getting dragged along in the dream somewhere that you did not intend to be. And pretty much this was what that experience was. I expected to see a certain deity. I turned to the water, and standing behind me in the water up to his knees is the god Jehudi. A lot of people refer to him as Thoth, who was not a deity that I had a relationship with. I knew who he was, obviously, but we didn't have a personal relationship. So this is already strange. I'm like, okay, all right, hi. I have no idea why I'm seeing this deity. Why is this happening? And he walks out of the water and he comes up to me and he says, well, now that we have your attention, we have a job for you to do. And then there are other deities. And it didn't make sense. I was very confused. I was scared. They were deities that I had never experienced before. And yes, they were very powerful. I think one of the things that makes the Egyptian gods wonderful to me is that you always are conscious that they could squish you flat, but they don't. They choose not to. So there's sort of a lovely thing there where you're always conscious of the power and the majesty that resides within them. But towards mortals, they are very, very gentle and very kindly. And so while they were indeed big and terrifying, they were all being very kindly. And they had things to say, and they were all very meaningful. And then they left, and then I had to sit and think about what I had seen and whether it made sense or not. It was a lot. It was a whole lot. When people describe this, because I've talked about this experience in a number of different places when people have asked me about the history of the temple. And I think when other people describe it, they think that I must have been, filled with awe and so excited and driven and ready to do this great thing that the deities asked me to do. But frankly, I was terrified. I was terrified and confused, and nothing had gone according to plan, and I was sure I was going to get in trouble. I walked out of that room with no idea what I was going to do. Other than that, I understood that what I had seen meant something and that I couldn't just lie about it and say that something else had happened.
This is such an important point, Dr. Siuda, that you've made before, which is a lot of people, when they talk about working with deity, or even in the grimoire tradition, very powerful beings, archangels, etc., they say, or they might say, I work with the gods. But you've made the point before, you don't work with deities. You work with, tools and pencils and paper and things like that. Can you kind of elaborate on why it's so important to have that clarity of term, that you don't work with the deities, you have this worship towards the deities, and just how important it is to, use the right terminology?
I think for me, I understand the reasoning behind using that term, and I get it in English usage. But you're right. For me, the deities are not tools. And so I would not speak about them in that way. It also comes down to the way that you define your relationship with these beings. There are people in the magical traditions, and lots of magical traditions, who are either atheists or agnostics, and who either don't believe in deities or they're not sure that deities exist. And so when they're approaching these things, they're not actually thinking about the Necheru or other gods as independent beings. They're thinking about them as archetypes. They're thinking about them allegorically. They're thinking about them as like intellectual exercises. And there's a place for that, absolutely. And I don't have anything against people who do that. I can't do that myself. My own experience with spiritual beings of lots of different types, and I have also done ceremonial magic in my life. I was in a lodge, and that was actually why I had to leave a lodge. I eventually ended up leaving my Golden Dawn derived tradition because I was extremely uncomfortable with the idea of invoking Egyptian deities as not real beings, because that had never been the experience for me. From the very beginning, these things were not figments of my own mind or my own soul or my own imagination or my own intellectual pursuits. They were independent, actual actors. And I could not abstract them in that way.
Dr. Siuda, this kind of goes to one of those things that people do talk about, which is the quote-unquote psychological model of spiritual engagement and the spirit model, spiritual of engagement. And for you, the psychological model, kind of putting everything into an archetypical kind of, this is an archetype, this is something that is deeply embedded in the human psyche and evolutionary consciousness over hundreds of thousands of years. That is not the case. There is an absolute independent existence of these deities, and until you've experienced it, just as you have, and so many people have not, until you've gone through that, it's very hard to English. It's very hard to express or to put into words.
It is. And I owe a lot to my indigenous upbringing there, too. Everything is a person. Trees are people. Animals are people. Insects are people. Water is people. Our entire worldview is built around relationships with others. I don't want to say that we neglect the intellectual, because we don't. There are also indigenous intellectuals and indigenous academic people like myself, but we don't generally define our world as human-centric. We are just one group of people in the universe. In this sort of definition, gods are also people. That would be why I would not reduce them. They're just another population. It's another group that I can get to know. They're more friends, if that makes sense.
Really, Dr. Siuda, speaking of Kemetic Orthodoxy, that kind of leads to another point, which is so many listeners are familiar with the quote-unquote Solomonic grimoiric tradition, right? From the PGM in the Byzantine Empire, the Renaissance and beyond, where there are these procedures that many listeners are familiar with, these materia magica. There's a consecrated circle, there's a phylactery, there's an invocation of divine names, there's a use of binding spirits that perhaps in a hierarchical structure might be considered further on down the hierarchy. Are any of these so-called grimoiric methods present in Kemetic Orthodoxy? Are there consecrated circles and phylacteries of protection? Can you just kind of share with the listeners some of the differences and potentially some of the similarities there?
The grimoire traditions owe a lot to ancient Egypt, so those things didn't just come into existence after Egypt. Egyptian magical traditions have a very long pedigree. So a lot of those different things, the use of certain words, the use of certain implements to direct magical intentions, the use of incantation, obviously, those things come from ancient Egypt, and we do them. We actually do that kind of work in Kemetic Orthodoxy too. We use the ancient term for that, which is heka. Heka, Egyptologists translate it as authoritative utterance, which means something sort of and sort of not, and I would translate that a little bit better as speaking with intention. It's more than just saying words, but it's also doing actions and other things that reinforce the words to make the magic. And yes, we do perform those things. In terms of specifics, the magical circle is something that was done in ancient Egyptian magic, but not to invoke spirits. Usually it was done to keep them away. Sort of like in the Solomonic tradition, if you wanted to invoke a demon and you didn't want it wandering all over your workshop, then you would draw a circle and you would invoke it inside the circle and then it couldn't get out. So that same idea does occur. We have some early magical texts where circles are being drawn around beds. If you want to go to sleep and not have nightmares, then you draw a circle around your bed and then you sleep inside the circle. There are circles that are being drawn by midwives around the birthing bricks where a woman is trying to give birth to keep her safe during that time from any kind of illness or any kind of misfortune. You do see that thing. You see circles, you see wands, you see the wearing of certain colors or the saying of certain words. There are collections of utterances or magical spells in books that people keep. We have, from antiquity, we actually have examples of magicians' boxes or bags, containers that have scrolls full of ritual in them and then various magical tools that they were using to do that. Wands and string to do not magic and amulets and phylacteries and all kinds of interesting stuff. A lot of those things, not just the Solomonic tradition, but even also the medical traditions. A lot of Renaissance folk magic in Europe derives from Egypt. The use of dolls or puppets, which later on becomes attributed to voodoo, where you talk about voodoo dolls and people are sticking pins in them. The first dolls with pins stuck in them appear in Pharaonic Egypt. And they are being used in love spells to force people to literally nail them down and make them love you. So these things do have a very ancient tradition that persists, not only in different Solomonic traditions and in things as diverse as Renaissance magic and hoodoo and things that are picking up those Renaissance traditions, but even also in Kemetic Orthodoxy, we do have various kinds of heka, both ancient ones that have been kept and modern ones that are being written.
Dr. Siuda, you've touched on briefly the kind of medical aspects as well. I think this might be a good time to talk about, obviously, the entire world is struggling right now with the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, and there are many comparisons being brought up with previous pandemics across the globe, and of course people are thinking about, the plague and influenza for hundreds of years was a global pandemic. Can you share with the listeners about how did the ancient Egyptians approach health and sickness, and what kind of deity did they work with to get specific effects for sickness or for healing?
So lots of deities, and in fact all of deities, any deity, can affect healing. While we do talk about deities being as the deity of X, it's not that limited. They might have a specialty, but each deity is capable of doing all the things or referring you to the deities who are better at it, if that's necessary. In antiquity, in particular, priests of Sekhmet, the goddess Sekhmet, and the goddess Serket were known for being very good at healing things. In particular, sometimes in the pharaonic language, in the hieroglyphic language, the phrase priest of Sekhmet can be a euphemism, that it isn't actually somebody who was a priest of Sekhmet necessarily, but this person is a surgeon, that they do medical work. They set bones, they stitch up wounds, they take care of sick people. And also the priests of Serket were known for this work. Not necessarily, in that case, it wasn't so much physical work, it wasn't surgery, but the priests of Serket were known for working with medicines and for diagnosis and treatment. And so together they would work. A lot of the temples to these goddesses had infirmaries. They had places where people could come to be healed of illnesses. The ancients did not distinguish between spiritual illness and physical illness. They thought that all illnesses would have both components, and so they treated both components. We have surgical manuals. One of the biggest ones that we're aware of is referred to as Papyrus Ebers now. It's a surgical manual. It's basically a book for a surgeon to read that lists hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different symptoms and descriptions of illnesses and injuries, and then explains what the doctor can do for them. And these incantations, I've actually written some academic papers about that papyrus, so I'm familiar with it. Each of the little entries in the surgical manual is divided into several parts. The first part describes the condition. The second part is basically one line that says, you can treat this, or there's nothing you can do. And so the doctor would then say to the patient, this is something we can treat, or sorry for your luck, go home, take care of yourself. And then the third part of the incantation would say, what the doctor could do, whether that was, for example, if you had a certain kind of gynecological disorder that was treatable, then you told the woman that you could treat it. And then the third part of the papyrus would say, these are the herbs that you mix up, and this is what you tell them to do with them. And so there would be something mechanical, something with medicine, something with doing something to ease the illness or the injury. And then there would be also something spiritual. There would be a prayer that you were supposed to say, or an incantation that was done to invoke a deity or a spirit to help with the healing. So it all went together. And plagues and illnesses were with the ancient Egyptians, had them just like we do. They did seem to have an understanding that such things were spread by people being together, and so they encouraged people to separate from other people if that was necessary, to stay in their houses. The spiritual dimension of a plague they considered to be a demon, a negative spirit. Sometimes those were referred to as arrows, and particularly the arrows of the goddess Sekhmet. An arrow is a spiritual being whose purpose is to damage or destroy. Obviously, that damage or destruction can be positive or negative. Sekhmet's arrows can be sent out to destroy evildoers, but Sekhmet's arrows are also plagues, and they can go out and they can hurt people, because if they're out of control and they're wandering around sticking arrows in everybody, then everybody gets sick. So there were incantations around, controlling those arrows, praying to Sekhmet to say, okay, can you put your arrows back in your quiver? Enough of us are sick now, thank you. Or to encourage them to not be spread or to be appeased. At the beginning of every year in the ancient New Year's rites, which we, as Kemetic Orthodox, we actually still do these rites on New Year's Day, there's a huge ritual that's done to encourage every single spirit of misfortune, any bad luck spirit, any misfortune spirit, any illness spirit, to be happy. We give them offerings, we tell them that we're not mad at them, and we basically ask them to stay very far away from us for the rest of the year. And so that is a tradition that the ancient Egyptians did every year. It was referred to as the turning of the dangers of the year. In our temple, we are actually saying a piece of that prayer every day now that this virus has started and now that there's a plague, basically to remind these spirits that we asked them to be nice to us this year, and please be nice to us. That's not, and like I said, going back to the idea of that this is not just spiritual and it's not just medical. We're not just praying to be relieved. We're not ignoring the other parts of it, but at the same time, we are also taking care of ourselves. We are isolating. We are washing our hands. We are doing all the things that you're supposed to do on both sides.
We do, Dr. Siuda, have a listener question from Tree, who is part of the, and again, please forgive my pronunciation, the Akhet Kemetic Temple of Denver. I hope I did okay with that. Probably not, but Thank you. So Tree, who's part of the Akhet Kemetic Temple of Denver, has the following questions. And the first question that Tree has for you is, how does Dr. Siuda apply the philosophy of living in Ma'at to the current public health crisis? And can you maybe, Dr. Siuda, share a little bit about what is Ma'at and how it does apply to the current COVID-19 situation?
That's a good question. So Ma'at is both a goddess and a concept. So it's a concept, but we deify it, and we think of it also as a being, as a goddess, specifically as the very first goddess who was created by the creator. So the very first thing that came into being in the universe is Ma'at. Ma'at in English is not sufficient, frankly, to translate this term. It often gets translated as truth or as order, but English has specific meanings around those things that don't necessarily apply. Ma'at is the entire embodiment of the way that things should be. For your audience, I would actually draw a sort of comparison to Crowley, when Crowley talks about magic and its relationship to will, where you essentially have this idea that if everybody was doing their will, everything would be okay. There is a higher purpose for each created being, and if we found that thing, then a lot of the difficulties in the world would go away. If you put it in a Buddhist thought, Ma'at would be the lack of desire. When everybody was doing the right ways to be in right relationship with themselves, with the universe, with everything else. So Ma'at is this central idea of harmony, of order, of truth, of things going right, and the way that things should be, and the machinery of the universe. She is also the corrective nature of this harmony. So if people or situations are not harmonious, something in the universe over time bends them to like the arc of justice. Things have a natural way of being. They have a natural harmony. They have a natural order. And if we don't fight that, then we create more Ma'at. And the more Ma'at there is, the better the universe is for everybody. So Ma'at itself is also working to restore that universal harmony. So when you have bad actors and you have illness and you have things that go wrong, there are these tendencies in the universe. The Ma'at in the universe is also working to try to reshape that and pull us back from those places of disharmony and illness and misfortune and get us back into the good place. So it works on its own, but it works faster if we help it. And in a time like this, where we are reminded how each single individual, each person on the whole planet is related to another person, and the things that you do or do not do affect other people. This is a reminder from Ma'at that all of our actions have consequences, that we're never free of those consequences, and that it is in our collective best interest to do good things and to do things that grow Ma'at and help each other. You might personally, literally, not be able to help anybody at all in terms of their own dealing with the plague, other than to stay home and to not give it to anybody else, or to help someone make sure that they can eat so that they're not hungry, so that they're not more likely to get an illness. We're not all personally responsible for the entire thing, but each of us can play a part. And that's the idea of the Ma'at there. And so that's what I would say to Tree. It's our responsibility right now to work even harder at the work that we should have already been doing.
That kind of goes to Tree's second question, which is, do you, Dr. Siuda, have any guidance for Kemetics living in this dark time? So it sounds like embracing Ma'at in terms of that kind of universal corrective force and doing whatever you can in your own individual way to increase that harmony. Would that be a somewhat fair statement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's on every level. So on the physical levels, doing the things that slow or stop the spread of the virus are very important, and spiritual things are also very important. And it's important to take care of yourselves when you're isolated and you're scared and other people are isolated and scared. It's important to reach out to your spirits and to your deities. In the Kemetic case, we are definitely praying to Sekhmet. I have asked my people to pray to Sekhmet every day. I posted a public prayer, and I've also encouraged them to share it with other people if they want. But just in general, we want to be healthy, and we want to be healthy on all levels. So that's also going to be spiritual health. And some of health comes through our own actions. Some of it does not. We might not necessarily be able to avoid catching the virus, but we can avoid spreading it. There are ways that we can, not only mitigate our exposure, but mitigate our experience. If we do catch it, then maybe we won't be as sick. If we are careful and we don't spread it too quickly, then we don't overwhelm the medical personnel who will be very necessary to getting people through. We look out for each other and we make sure that the most vulnerable are taken care of. These are the important things. These are all part of Ma'at, and everybody can do them. Maybe they can't do them all. Maybe they can't do them all at once. But there's always something that you can do. Always.
Can you talk about how, depending on the situation, that there is an Egyptian prayer, there is a consecratory procedure that can help maybe an individual attain a level of health or purification?
Yes. And one of the benefits of having that culture that lasts for so long, thousands and thousands of years, we have probably millions of pieces of evidence of the sorts of things that the ancient Egyptians did ritually and spiritually for lots of different kinds of stuff. When I first started doing Egyptian magic, one of my earliest teachers said to me that the ancient Egyptian religion was a secret society that only the most elite were allowed to be a part of, and then they never wrote anything down and they taught everything orally, and so everything was lost. And she kind of used that as her excuse to make up anything she wanted and say that it was ancient Egyptian. And I kind of knew, at that point I hadn't really gotten into my study very deeply, but I knew that that didn't make sense. Many, many thousands of years of an open culture. Sure, yes, there were things that were restricted to certain individuals, but the idea that the entire culture wrote nothing down and we don't know anything about them, it didn't make any sense to me. And when I went and actually became a professional and started to translate ancient texts, I will never personally be able to read every text there is. There are more texts than anybody. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Egyptologists, probably thousands actually, in the last 150 years, and there will be more. And people will keep finding material. There is lots of material. There is material that we don't even know about yet. There's lots. And in fact, it might be a little bit difficult and a little bit daunting to find that material, but the material does exist. There are prayers for everything. There are prayers for every condition. There are prayers to every deity. There are rituals that do lots of different things. They're not required, because this is a devotional practice that I do in Kemetic Orthodoxy and not only a magical practice. You don't have to know an ancient text or an ancient purificatory ritual to do purifications. Some of them are very nice, and some of them we like to use, but you're not required to. It's enough to go to the deities and talk to them. It's enough the relationships are also important. And what you lack, you'll be directed to. That was also our experience in building Kemetic Orthodoxy. When we wanted a ritual for such and such a thing, if we couldn't find it, if we went to the deities and we prayed and we said, we'd really like to have a ritual for such and such, not very long afterward, somebody would find it, or somebody would send it to us, or, I would be at school and we would have a homework assignment, and lo and behold, here's an incantation that does exactly what we wanted to find out about a couple of months ago. These sorts of things happened over time. There's lots. We don't have enough time to talk about the thousands and thousands and thousands of things that people can do if they want to do them. But I can talk about sort of the general foundations of it. Yes, there are magical operations that people can do. Do they need to do them? Maybe, maybe not. Do they want to do them? Sure. It's good to use some foresight and to think these things out and to think about the logistics of them. And as long as you're approaching the deities respectfully, and as long as you're approaching the culture respectfully, I think that you're doing it right.
One of the listener questions we have, Dr. Siuda, is from Ellen Behrens, who is asking, what is the Reverend Dr. Siuda's most transformative experience? And I know that you've shared experience in the Wiccan ceremony. Obviously, that was incredibly transformative. But can you share with Ellen and the listeners about perhaps other experiences or something that really kind of permanently shifted your consciousness? Although you've had so many of those.
I think also once you get to be old, unless you've lived in a box, you've had experiences. And I have been fortunate not to live in a box. That's a tough question. I suppose that it would be appropriate to say that probably the most transformative experience for me would have been in November of 1996 when I went to Egypt to undergo coronation rituals to become a nisut, or a sacred king. I had never had any intention to do that whatsoever. I was brought up indigenous in the United States of America, and we don't need kings. And, the whole idea of monarchy is ridiculous, and the whole idea of that kind of leadership is ridiculous, and I am not starting a cult, and all of that. And I fought that mightily. I fought it with every fiber of my being for at least 5 years, when we were doing ceremonies and deities were sending dreams and were sending messages to various people in the temple who were saying, well, if you're going to reconstruct this thing, then you need to have a sacred king because there are ritual and magical reasons for this. And so then we said, okay, well, we'll do it on rotation and everybody will act as a king in a certain ritual and it'll be fine. And the deities were like, no, that's not enough. It needs to be very specific. It needs to be done the right way. If you're insisting that you're going to do this the cultural right way, then you need to do it the right way. And somebody needs to do this. Well, eventually, over much protest, they convinced me that this was necessary, that this was something that they wanted from me. And then I continued to put up a fight, and I said, well, that's great, except we'd have to go to Egypt to do that for 2 weeks, and I don't have the money, and I don't have the time, and it won't work. And within that year, the money and the time all came to us. And it all came down. And so on the proper day of the year in 1996, I was standing in Saqqara at the coronation dais, doing all of the traditional rituals that had been done thousands of years ago to do this thing. And that was probably the most transformative thing that I have ever done, because ever since then, I have been a different person. I have not just been myself. I have also been representative of that sacred kingship for my people. And that's a big deal. Kind of like my first thing that I said to you where, it all sounds like it must be amazing, but actually I was terrified. Exactly the same. Yes, I am a sacred king. No, it probably doesn't mean what most people think it means. I'm not laying on a couch somewhere being fed grapes. It's not, it's not perfect. It doesn't make me infallible. It doesn't make me immortal. It doesn't do any of those things. It just gives me a whole lot of work to do and a whole lot of responsibilities. But it also enables, and this was the main reason that I agreed to do that work, was that it was explained to me that the existence of the individual in that position opens up the door to a bunch of other things that were not possible during the periods when there was not someone in that position. So it's not even about the person who's doing it. It's about the existence of that person. You don't have to believe in a king. You don't have to do anything for the king, but the king's existence, and this is very similar to other sorts of sacred kingship and other kinds of cultures. The existence of a sacred king makes a bridge between the spiritual world and the physical world and permits certain things to occur that couldn't occur before, or permits things to occur more easily that could be done before but were a lot more difficult to do. Since I did this work, since I took this on in 1996, at least in our temple, we have seen tremendous growth and tremendous positive things. A lot of things came out of this that we never would have expected. If you had told me back in 94 or 96 when we started doing this, that, there would be 600 people doing this and I would be doing a podcast and talking about this experience to other people, I would have laughed. I never would have expected any of these things to occur, but they did. To answer that question, that would be the most transformative experience, at least in the sense of the one that I can never walk away from.
Kind of almost borders on boggling the mind just to think about that.
When you talk about it, you sound completely crazy. Exactly.
That sounds absolutely, as you mentioned, terrifying, amazing, poignant, overwhelming. I mean, my goodness, it's really hard to, even just for someone who's hearing it, just to imagine that, which is just incredible. And
it's been decades, and I'm still getting used to the idea.
Wow. To Dr. Siuda, your experience, both kind of working and researching and writing, but also worshiping and engaging with the deities, one of the things that I think is so rejuvenating is how you kind of also dispel a lot of these kind of misconceptions about ancient Egypt. And I'd love to go through some of those with you. This is something that you've said elsewhere, that there's a misconception people have that Egyptians were obsessed about death because all we have this is what the misconception is. We have the pyramids, we have mummies, we have burial rites, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we have Brendan Fraser and the Mummy running around in 1922, summoning, demons from the darkest depths of Egyptian tombs. Clearly, Dr. Siuda, the ancient Egyptians were only obsessed about death, correct?
No, not correct. Our assumption about death. Obviously, death is of great importance to us, too. I'm not going to say it wasn't important to them, because it was. Death is always important to mortals. But the reason that we focus on death, in particular around Egypt, is simply, it's the reality of the archaeological situation. In Egypt, things are very well preserved because it's dry, because most of it's a desert, and they buried people in the desert, so all of the tombs are in the desert, and that's where we find them. And additionally, like many other cities in North Africa and in the Middle East in general, the cities get grown on top of cities. In certain parts of the United States, cities are created out of nothing. There's nothing here and then suddenly there's a city. This is not the case in Egypt. If there's a city in Egypt, there are all the other versions of that city going back thousands and thousands and thousands of years underneath that city. Or they tore them down to build new things. But in a lot of cases, they're beneath. And when you visit Egypt, you'll notice that a lot of cities that exist or towns that exist are elevated and they're on little hills. Those are actually the remnants of the previous cities, and they're basically building on top, on top, on top. This is why we don't know as much about Egyptian life as we do about Egyptian death, because we don't get to do as much archaeological work in the city, and not as much of the material from the ancient cities is preserved. It's simply the luck of what survived and what didn't. At some point, they made an assumption about it. Clearly, they must have been very, very interested in death because all we can find is mummies. Well, all we can find is mummies is because the cemeteries weren't built on top of, and because they did do very nice things for dead people who had money. Now, there are lots of poor people who didn't get fancy burials at all, but the fancy burials are indeed quite fancy, and some of them have gold and jewels in them, and so that was of great interest to the people who were tearing open tombs looking for such things. That is entirely a modern assumption, that the ancient Egyptians were fascinated with death and that everything was about death. Not really. And even if you read the funerary texts, the texts that are being included with these mummies, they're about living. They're about living in the other world. They're about being able to interact with the living. So they're also about life, even though they're situated in a situation of death.
Dr. Siuda, to that point, in terms of kind of setting the record straight, we do have many listener questions, and we have 3 listener questions from Douglas of the What Magic Is This podcast, who says, I have 3 questions I ask every Egyptologist that I come across. For the record, you are the first Egyptologist I've come across. So Douglas says, I love these because the answers are always idiosyncratic and usually hugely informative. And so the first question that Douglas has, Dr. Siuda, and you really are going to have to forgive my horrible pronunciation of this. What do you think happened to the pyramid of Djefra? I cannot pronounce this at all. Please help me.
Djedefra.
Djedefra. Thank you, Dr. Siuda. So what do you think happened to the pyramid of Djedefra?
So, Djedefra was a son of the king Khufu, or called Khafren, who is the keeper of the largest of the pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramid. And he built a pyramid not at Giza. He decided not to be buried at the same space that his father was buried for whatever reason, and he had his pyramid built at a site a little bit further away, which is now called Abu Roash, which is where a number around the space that is Djedefra's pyramid, there are a number of what are called solar temples. So they're temples that are to the god Ra, temples to the sun. Djedefra was the first of the kings that we're aware of who called himself son of Ra. And after that, every single king referred to themselves as a son of Ra. That was like a title that everybody got. But he was the first one. So he was personally very interested in the god Ra and the worship of Ra. And the solar temples that were built during that dynasty were probably, if they weren't built by him, they were built by people who were associated with him. So it makes sense that he wanted to be buried amongst the temples of his god. There are some indications that there were also some family troubles between him and his brother, Khafra or Khafren. So we have this idea, so some Egyptologists will say, well, he wanted to be buried there because he would be near his god. And some Egyptologists are saying he wanted to be buried there because he didn't want to be anywhere near his brother, who was building his pyramid next to Ded. And then others will say that he was actually kicked out. There is some argument that Djedefra was not getting along with the rest of the family, and so they kicked him out of Giza and wouldn't let him be buried there. We don't know for sure. What we do know for sure is that for some reason he was not building his pyramid in the same place. Unlike the 3 pyramids at Giza, very, very little is left of the Jedefra pyramid, to the extent that for a very long time it was mistaken as being just another one of the solar temples. There were people who said, oh, he didn't even build a pyramid, he just built a temple and had himself buried in it. But it is probably a pyramid. There is a group, a French and Swiss group of archaeologists who are doing research there right now, and they have concluded from the remnants of what they found and the angles of the walls and various things, they're pretty sure that it was a pyramid. And basically the pyramid was dismantled over many thousands of years by people who wanted to use the stones for other buildings. There's a Coptic monastery nearby. There was a Roman city nearby. So that has also been going on for thousands of years. Now, Jedefra's pyramid was built probably somewhere around like 3500 BC. That's a long time. That's 5,000 years that people could be picking off stones. And they have found stones that can be traced back to that building in other structures. So we know that happened. That's also something that happens routinely across Egypt. If a city needs stones and there's a pharaonic monument outside town that has really good stones in it, they took them away. During the Roman period, some temples and tombs were deliberately dismantled in order to make lime, that they actually took the stones and melted them down to create quicklime for other kinds of building. And we've lost a lot. That's another reason that we have more tombs than temples. We've lost a lot of monuments due to this, robbing of stone or reusing of stone. What I think happened to Jedefra's pyramid was what happened to a lot of pyramids. The ones at Giza are so big and so beautiful that either people were afraid to take them apart or, decided that it was a lost cause. And even those three have had most of their outer stones removed. Only the third pyramid has a bit of its bottom casing, which is red granite and is beautiful. And the second pyramid, if you look at the images, still has some of its pyramidion, the point at the top. But most of them, they look like just piles of blocks. And those are the understones. The overstones, they were covered and smooth and painted and beautiful. But all of those stones were taken away thousands of years ago.
Douglas is also asking, Dr. Siuda, what would you say to someone who doesn't think the pyramids were tombs, but perhaps a star-matching ritualistic structure whereby the kings would draw the heavens to earth? And then in addition to that, Jeffrey Smith is asking, does Dr. Siuda believe that the Great Pyramid was used as a tomb for a pharaoh or something else?
I'm going to answer those questions with another question, and that is, why can't they be both? Think about everything else in this culture that does not separate the spiritual and the physical. The texts, the funerary texts of the kings in those pyramids in that period, which we refer to as the pyramid texts because they are carved inside some of the pyramids. The big three at Giza do not have inscriptions in them, but later ones do. So anyway, those texts, what we call the pyramid texts now, they talk about the kings rising and becoming part of the stars, who are themselves the embodiments of the ancestors. So when they go to the ancestors, they go to the sky, they become stars. And when we look at the stars, then we see our ancestors. So I don't personally see any reason why they can't be both things. Why can't the pyramid not only be a resting place for a person, but also a ritual object that signals or helps the soul of the dead person to ascend to the sky? The Great Pyramid, actually all of the big pyramids have shafts, very tiny. These are only 7-8 inches across, little holes in them. And they're tunnels, and they go all the way down to the burial chamber. But they also point out at the sky. And if you were a person and you were standing at the bottom and you were looking up this shaft outside the pyramid, certain stars would be framed in the square at certain times of the year. So I think it's absolutely possible and probably probable that these pyramids do serve that ritual purpose. Not only are they a place for someone to be buried, but they are also a place that magically enables the connection between the living and the dead. And they're not maybe not aliens, and they're not water pumps or grain storage or batteries, any of that. It's all very interesting, but they're not.
Well, to that point, Dr. Siuda, pyramids, all right, but what about the Sphinx? We have two questions from Jeffrey Smith for you about the Sphinx. The first is, does the doctor believe that there are spaces below the Sphinx? And if yes, could you share why you think that? And then the second question about the Sphinx is, what are Dr. Siuda's thoughts on the work of Dr. Robert Schoch and the idea that the Sphinx is much older than generally accepted by mainstream academia?
Okay, so there are multiple chambers beneath the Sphinx. We know because they've done some testing, they've done some digging, they've done some ground-penetrating radar. They are aware that there are voids or spaces underneath the Sphinx of varying size. One of my colleagues, who was actually my master's degree advisor at the University of Chicago, or was one of my master's degree, he was going to be my doctoral advisor, but then he found the pyramid village at Giza and stopped working. His name is Mark Lehner. He's written a number of books about the pyramids. They found one of these chambers and opened it up, and inside they found newspapers dating from the early 1900s and shoes. So clearly these chambers had been open at some point, and humans had been inside them, in recent memory. Nobody has found any kind of library. I believe it was Edgar Cayce who used to say that there was a secret library of Atlantis hidden underneath the Sphinx. Nobody's ever found it. It's entirely possible that there are other rooms that we haven't gotten to underneath the Sphinx. Sphinx is pretty big. I don't know that they are necessary. In front of the Sphinx, there is an entire temple that is dedicated to honoring not only the people who are buried in that necropolis, but the Sphinx itself as a manifestation of Horus. So I don't know that they needed to put any rooms underneath it because they had lots of rooms to do things in front of it. But sure, there are probably more spaces to be found. I don't know what we'll find in them. There's nothing on the Sphinx in terms of the inscriptions on the stela or anything around it that indicates that there is any kind of room or building or something underneath that we need to find. In terms of the work of Dr. Schoch, who also worked with somebody else, Robert Bauval, they wanted to prove that the Sphinx was at least 10,000 years old to match it with a certain star map. And I thought it was a really lovely symbolic idea, but again, I don't think it was necessary. One of the main problems that I have with Dr. Schoch's work, now Dr. Schoch is not an Egyptologist, he's a geologist, he studies rocks. And so he teamed up with Dr. Bauval to say that the Sphinx was definitely older than 3,500, 3,800 BC, which I have to agree with. The rocks of the Sphinx absolutely are older than that. The rocks have been there since the beginning of time. You can't date rocks. You can't carbon date a rock. We can't say when the stone that was carved into the Sphinx. Now, the Sphinx is a lion-bodied, man-headed statue that was carved out of natural rock. So the natural rock was already there. They put the face on it at some point. And so the argument is, did they carve it at the time of Khafra, who claimed to do so, or did it happen earlier? And on a certain level, no, we really can't know. Obviously, the rock was already there. It might have been carved at one point. It might not have been carved at one point. The features of the existing Sphinx match the rest of the art from that same time period. They match data and information that we have from that same time period. I don't personally have any reason to believe that it's older, and I don't personally believe there are other parts of that theory where the Sphinx has to be 10,000 years old in order to match a certain star map that I disagree with. I don't think that the belt of Orion, so I'm going to summarize this very, very quickly. Their whole theory was that the reason that the three Giza pyramids are if you've ever looked at a picture of them, you see that they're sort of in a diagonal line. And the reason, according to Schoch and Bauval, the reason that the pyramids are in that line is because they have been designed to match the belt of the constellation that we call Orion. Now, the ancient Egyptians did not call it Orion, and they didn't give it the same significance that the Greeks did, so there's already a problem. But they gave it different experience and associated it with Seir or Osiris, who's the god of the dead. So that is significant. And yes, the belt of Orion is significant. And yes, the image of the pyramids in a row does look an awful lot like the three stars in the belt of Orion. It really does. That being said, the next part of their theory is that in order for the pyramids to have been built that way, those three stars had to be directly overhead at the time, which, according to astronomy, would have been 10,000 years ago. Now, I will tell you right now that I could go out in my front yard and I could take 3 cardboard boxes and I could line them up to look like the belt of Orion, and I could do that today. I don't have to have the 3 stars of Orion right directly above my head in order to do that. I know what those stars look like, and I can do that. So that's where that theory completely falls apart for me. It's not necessary for this thing to have been created at the celestial time when those stars were directly above in order for it to look like that. They were capable of doing that at any time. I do agree that part of the theory where they've decided that the reason that they're in the diagonal line is because they're supposed to look like the belt of Orion. I do agree with that. I don't agree that it had to happen at the time of the celestial conjunction of those items.
I really appreciate this, and I know the listeners will as well, you elucidating that and kind of setting the record straight. And Douglas is asking, Dr. Siuda, where and what was the Kingdom of Punt? Punt, thank you. Where and what, Dr. Siuda, was the Kingdom of Punt?
So the Kingdom of Punt is mentioned in a number of ancient texts going really far back as a place that the Egyptians, they didn't rule it, so it wasn't a colony, but they had a trade agreement with them, and they visited them on boats. Now, this is different. Most of the trade material that we know about was overland trade. They were going south, they were going east and up into what is now Israel and Syria and Turkey and areas like that. They were going north on boats to Greece and Crete, and obviously these were called different things at that time, but across the Mediterranean, they were going across North Africa, they were going south into sub-Saharan Africa, but we don't usually hear about them taking boats to the east, because boats to the east would imply that they would need to go through what is now the Suez Canal, which didn't exist at the time. So how would they get there? The Kingdom of Punt was east of Egypt and was a place where the Egyptians were sending boats to get primarily myrrh, which is the sap of a tree. Frankincense and myrrh and other kinds of aromatic herbs and things that they were using in medicine and in incense and fruits and animals and a whole bunch of different things. In different time periods, you have tomb or temple pictures of expeditions to Punt and showing what they brought back, baskets and baskets and baskets of fruits, figs and myrrh and all kinds of ostrich feathers and giraffes and all kinds of very interesting things that appear that are clearly not Egyptian things, but they're being got as trade goods. During the reign of the New Kingdom female king Hatshepsut, there was a huge expedition to Punt that she decorated an entire wall of one of her temples with, which has pictures of the king and the queen of Punt and various things associated with it. We don't know for sure, but we think that Punt was located in areas that are now considered to be part of Ethiopia or Eritrea, so over to the east on the Horn of Africa. We're not entirely certain exactly what area it was. We do know that there was a canal that was built from the city of Memphis, which is today just outside of Cairo, that went all the way to the Red Sea. So they had a canal that was much longer than the current Suez Canal, that went straight through the eastern desert out to the areas that became Punt. I have heard somebody give a theory that Punt is actually Yemen, and that it was across the sea and not on the same side of the sea as Egypt. There are harbors. They have found some ancient harbors that have remnants of ancient Egyptian boats in them, have been found in Eritrea, have been found in Yemen. So that could also be part of it. We're not entirely certain where Punt was. We know it was east. We know it was valuable for trade. And, the giraffes and such would imply that it probably wasn't the Arabian Peninsula. It was probably still Africa.
As well, too, Dr. Siuda, this just popped into my head, and it's so random and juvenile, and you've been asked it probably a million times, but I'm going to do it anyway. Is the curse of opening Tutankhamun's tomb a real thing? And especially whether you're talking about Kemetic Orthodoxy or things like that in terms of more malignant operations, is that something that was practiced a lot? Can you just take us back to that time period and opening of the tomb and curses and things like that?
So the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb happened in the 20s. So we're coming up on the anniversary pretty soon. A bunch of really weird and kind of bad things happened right around that time period. Not only was the world plunging into depression and war and bad things, the British lord who was bankrolling the dig became very ill and died. On the day that he died, there was a huge blackout in Cairo. There were all kinds of various conversations that it must have something to do with the opening of the tomb. This had more to do with superstition than anything else. There is nothing inside that particular tomb that is worded in the way of a curse. Now, I'm not going to say that there is no such thing, because there are such things. There are some tombs, they have descriptions on the outside of them that say something to the effect of, if someone disturbs my tomb, may their neck be broken like a bird. There are indeed some tombs that warn people not to disturb them, that warn people not to be disrespectful to the person who's buried inside. So that does exist, and the dead do punish people who are disrespectful to them. That is a tradition in ancient Egypt. We talk about the muet, or the angry dead, dead people who have been wronged in some way, who can do damage to others. We have incantations both to send them away and also to send them towards people. If there are people that are causing you trouble, you can send one of these angry dead people to, cause them trouble right back. That kind of stuff does exist. We don't have any indication that it existed in the case of King Tut. The man who actually excavated the tomb, Howard Carter, not only took all of King Tut's things out of the tomb, he personally removed King Tut from his own sarcophagus using an acetylene torch, because the mummy was stuck inside of the golden coffin with some resin that had been poured over the mummy when it had been put in the tomb. So if he was capable of completely dismembering the pharaoh and didn't die an early death, I don't know that we can say that there was a curse.
Thank you for putting the 6-year-old child inside me to bed once and for all.
I do want to say something, though, about tombs.
Oh, please.
And about the necessity of opening them and about being respectful of the dead. And here I speak not only as a devotee of the deities and someone who's very respectful of the Egyptian ancestors, but also as somebody who works as an Egyptologist and has been involved. I have actually done some research and some work with mummies. I'm on the fence about it. Do people need to be dug up? No, probably not. And in fact, a lot of mummies have been very roughly treated. A lot of people have been disrespected over time. I don't think that's a good thing. I am not in favor of digging up people's ancestors. At the same time, we have several centuries of colonialism where, lots of mummies were removed from their tombs, taken to very far away places, separated from their family, separated from all of their ritual tools that were supposed to keep them safe in the afterlife. I do think that there's a place for respectful Kemetic people in terms of religion, and also respectful academic people in terms of archaeology or Egyptology, to be respectful of those dead. We can think about whether or not they need to be on display in museums. We can think about, if they are, how to do that in a respectful way. When I worked at the Field Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum has a number of mummies on display. I worked with another Egyptologist, and we did what we could to make the display that is there as respectful as it could be. All of the mummies were moved. And originally, like when I was a kid and I visited that exhibit, it was like a garage sale. They were all just kind of scattered around on the floor in glass cases. And now all of the mummies in the entire exhibit are collected into one area, which has an entrance and an exit. The design of the area that they are in is designed to be like an ancient Egyptian tomb. The ceiling is painted with stars. The walls are painted with certain incantations. At the entrance to that space, we hung a copy of the prayer to be said for the ancestors and a list of all of the names of everybody who was there, so that if there was anybody who came to visit who wanted to be respectful, they could do that. And in fact, when I visit the exhibit, I do see a lot of people stop and read the prayer and say the names. And that's lovely, because that's an ancient tradition, because people did visit tombs in antiquity, and they went and they said certain prayers and they left offerings. So people still get to do that. At the front of that room, the very first mummy that people encounter is a man named Harwa, who was the gatekeeper of the door of the temple of Amun-et-Karnak. So his job was to visit people at the door. So we put him right inside the door so that he could visit people with the door, just like he used to do in life. It used to be fun when I worked in the museum in the mornings. I used to go every morning and say hello to him before I went to my office. I would go there first. And one morning, one of the janitors caught me. And were you talking to that mummy? Yes, and I told him about it. And then a couple of weeks later, I came by and he says, yeah, every time I go in there, I say hi to him. And so now a bunch of the people on the staff, talk to Harwa, because they understood that he liked doing that. He clearly was a people person. So now he's a people person in the afterlife. And then that's the sort of thing. It's like, okay, if they have to be on display, can we do it in a way that is not disrespectful? And if they don't have to be on display, can we give them back to Egypt? Can we repatriate them? Can they be put back in their tombs? Are there better ways to do this? The legacy of colonialism is such that for a long time, mummies weren't considered to be people. Now people are starting to get some thoughts about that, and they're rethinking that. And I'm very happy for that, and I want that to continue. Mummies are definitely people, and they definitely deserve to be respected.
In terms of that respect, and in terms of really making sure that people are putting their best foot forward always, we do have a question, Dr. Siuda, from Benjamin Lindsay, who is asking, I'd like to know what the good doctor would advise someone who wanted to get into Kemetic magic And Benjamin is asking what the overlay of Kemetic and Voodoo looks like in practice.
So, I do practice Haitian Voodoo. I have been a mambo or a priestess since 2001, but there is no overlay whatsoever between my practices. They are completely different. They are served in different spaces, and the work is different. They're also very culturally different. It does seem, during my experience doing both things, that my voodoo spirits do have respect for my Egyptian deities, but they are not gods, they're spirits, and it's different. And it is absolutely different. There's no comparison between the two things. My first comment to this question would be don't try to mix the two things because they don't mix very well. And that being said, there's nothing in Egyptian tradition, there's nothing in Kemetic tradition that says that you can't have multiple traditions. People in ancient Egypt honored and respected deities that were not Egyptian and deities that were not their own, and they didn't seem to have any kinds of issues with practicing multiple religions until later. Once you get out of the classical period and you get into the Coptic Orthodox period, and then there's a backlash against anything that isn't Christianity for a while. And then after the Arab conquest, there is both cultural and political pressure for people to convert to Islam. And then Islam, of course, does not permit, if you're a Muslim, you're not practicing other religions. So where that happens is not the pharaonic religion's doing. There's nothing in the pharaonic religion that doesn't acknowledge lots of gods and spirits and say that, it's your own business. Your relationships with spiritual beings are your own business, and there's nothing that's incompatible. I don't personally mix traditions. This is why I refer to what we do as Kemetic Orthodoxy or proper teaching. The idea that we take the Egyptian element of it very seriously. We don't eclecticize it. We're not mixing it with other things. Lots of our people have multiple traditions, but we keep them separated. If you become a full convert to Kemetic Orthodoxy, you become a full member, the expectation is that if you have other religious traditions, that you'll keep them separate, that you don't mix them.
Can you tell us a little bit, Dr. Siuda, not only about where people can find you and especially check out your books and your writings, but also can you share a little bit about where they can find you and support you on Patreon and all of the intensive training and courses as well that people can find there?
In terms of Kemetic Orthodoxy, in terms of the religion, we have two major websites. We actually do, almost all of our ministry has an online element. We do offline things too. Right now, clearly we've had to cancel a bunch of events, but hopefully they get to come back soon. But we're continuing to do all of our online work. You can find the religion, if you're interested in the religion itself, is at kemet.org. So KEMET.org is the official website for the Kemetic Orthodox religion. The temple, the main temple, we have a bunch of different shrines, but the main temple of the religion is called the House of Neter. And the House of Neter's website is neter.org, NETJER.org. That is a message forum, and we've got thousands of people there. Not everybody's a member. Some of them are just friends of ours, and we're talking about ancient Egyptian stuff all the time. You're welcome to come there and join. The Kemet website announces when we have beginners groups. If somebody was interested in becoming a member of the temple, we ask them to take a 16-week beginners class, which applies even if you already have a relationship with ancient Egyptian deities. It's not the idea that you're a beginner to Egyptian things, but you're a beginner to us. So the class goes over the sorts of things that we do, is a general introduction, and then at the end of that class, people have the option to join the temple if they want to, and they don't have to. The class is free. It's done entirely on the internet. Like I said, it happens every 16 weeks. Right now, I think we're in week 2 of the current class, so the next class won't start until probably mid-June, but we are taking applications, and people can join that class if they want. The neter.org, the temple forum, is open all the time. You don't have to take a class to do that. In terms of my books, most of my books are in print still. Available. I've written a bunch of books on Egypt. I've written one book on voodoo, which is not under my personal name, but is under my initiation name, which is Mambo Shitatan. It's called Haitian Voodoo, so it's pretty easy to find. I have a Patreon, which I'm using to pay my bills, and I do things about ancient Egypt there. Every day there's a post for the ancient Egyptian calendar, so if people are interested in the calendar, that's something to get. A little email every day that tells you when all the holidays are and who the gods of the day are and things like that. And then I am sharing additional material there, sneak peeks of my writing, details about what I'm doing in terms of projects. And I teach classes there if you're interested in learning ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, or I have a class currently in ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, so it's like ethics. I'm going to be putting up a class about literature and stories. I haven't added it yet. Also a class in Coptic, which is the later form of the Egyptian religion, which might be of interest to some of your magical folks who are doing classical work. There's a lot of Coptic language in the PGM, and knowing something about Coptic can be helpful there. I also, as part of the courses that I do, so I have classes that are open-ended classes that are taught online as part of the Patreon. And also on the Patreon, I am currently offering an opportunity for people to study ancient Egyptian magic itself, not as a class. I am thinking about doing a simple class, but right now I'm actually offering an apprenticeship. There are people who are personally studying with me to learn a kind of Egyptian magic that is related to protection of people. It is called Sau, or protective magic. That's the ancient term for it. People who did it were called Sau. So there is an apprenticeship for potential Sau. The cost for it currently is $25 per month. That enables people to have 30 minutes of time with me to work on their own, wherever they're at in their own apprenticeship. And also once a week, we get together for an hour with all of the apprentices and have conversations about where we're doing and what we're doing. There are individual tailored lessons to learn the work. There are 5 different kinds of that magic. I start out by teaching what kinds of magic they are, and then we branch out into actual exercises and people learning how to do this magic. By the end of the apprenticeship, people will actually be able to be ancient Egyptian magicians, obviously not ancient Egyptians, but people will be able to practice this magic and go out and do it in the world. And it's not just a knowledge-based thing, but it's a practice-based thing. It's the idea that you would become an apprentice and then you would actually be graduated from the apprenticeship and become a magician and do that work in the world. And I'm very surprised. I've had a lot more people interested in it than I thought. But I still have some spaces. I have a limited number of people that I can take on for that, obviously, to make sure everybody gets what they need. But there are still spaces in that apprenticeship if anybody's interested. And that is, you don't have to be Kemetic Orthodox. You don't even have to worship the ancient Egyptian gods to be part of it. I do have apprentices who are involved in other traditions, and they seem to be doing fine.
Dr. Tamara Siuda, professional Egyptologist, founder and spiritual leader of the Kemetic Orthodox religion and initiated Mambo priestess of Haitian Vodou. She's an author, and we really, really appreciate your time, Dr. Siuda. Thank you very much for your wisdom, as well as just the amazing energy and inspiration that you bring to Kemetic religion and ancient Egypt.
Thank you for having me on.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed the chat with Dr. Siuda as much as I did. Her wisdom on Kemetic Orthodoxy and ancient Egypt and setting the record straight on so many misconceptions that people have is wonderful. And I'm also wishing each and every one of you healing and protection during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Dr. Siuda's comments about how the ancient Egyptians approached healing and sickness really hit home. Also, thank you so much for your wonderful Glitch Bottle Patreon questions. And speaking of patrons and their awesome support and advice, if you are also inspired, you can always check out Glitch Bottle on patreon.com/glitchbottle, and you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. And if you leave an awesome review of stars or a thumbs up or anything and everything, that is always most welcome. And as always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to stay safe, wash your hands, invoke often, cover your cough, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.